My name is Marklen Konurbaev. I'm professor of the Faculty of Philology, Moscow State University. So my area of work is almost exclusively the humanities. So I work with literary texts, with ancient texts, with human beings, and with the way texts, ancient texts and modern texts actually are perceived by people. Therefore, it's highly important for me to be able to be dealing with people, and therefore I'm worrying a lot, as well as many of my colleagues worrying, about whether we're going to survive as a human civilization and not being transformed into a digital civilization. And the highest point of concern for me is the increasing competition between human beings and computers, which I think is very wrong. Because computers are used to serve human beings, while we human beings act in an absolutely different reality. So it's highly important for me to be able to explain this difference between how human civilization lives and works on the one hand, and how we make computers and digital worlds actually serve us. That's highly important for me. And when I notice that human civilization is actually readily and easily succumbs to the influence of the digital world and starts simplifying their reality around them, increasingly trying to bring it to the so-called matrix level, where we have the if-then relationship and where there is a one-to-one correspondence between the objects of reality, and we have almost increasingly, almost exclusively very often, one explanation instead of many explanations, possible variations of something. It worries me a lot, because we tend to be the civilization of people, of human beings, who is winning this world by communication, by developing highly the means of representation, the language, making it more and more complex, making it more and more involved in representing knowledge that we have. But at a certain point of time, we stopped sharing knowledge with each other and started sharing knowledge with computers, hoping that computers will cope with this task in a better manner. This is worrying. And during this lecture, I'm going to explain why it is worrying and how it should be solved. My name is Marklen Konurbaev. I'm professor of philology at Moscow State University. You're most welcome to watch my lecture and ask your questions. Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm professor of Moscow State University, working at the Faculty of Philology, and today I'm going to speak to you about language and knowledge. And what I'm going to say is actually has a strategic value, I think, for those who are making decisions in companies, and for students who are going to make decisions about where to work, how to work, and how to communicate. That's the most important thing, because in the 21st century, we're all obsessed with the so-called digitalization of our society and digitalization of our knowledge. But the fact is that digitalization is, if you think hard enough, is not such a good word, because it has many accents, it has many shades of meanings that you need to take into account when you think how to apply it to a human being. That's important. Okay, in the 21st century, the word digital becomes some sort of a praise, while the word analog or analog thinking becomes some sort of an anachronism. And you think why? Because all technologies, computers and databases and so on and so forth, is all involved in the process of the digitalization of knowledge. But let us think a little bit about how it works as compared to how we human beings think and communicate with each other. Let's go back to the prehistoric times, when the human beings became human beings in the proper sense of the word, and the cognitive revolution happened. We all know the book by Harari, Sapiens, where he described the so-called cognitive revolution that happened around 70,000 years ago. And at that time, a human being stopped being part of the animal world and became something more than that. The animal world around had so many benefits. They had claws, they had hard skin, they had teeth, and they could actually somehow defend themselves in this modern world, in the contemporary world for themselves. But the human being had actually nothing. It was a weak creature, and in order for that weak creature to survive somehow, he had to invent something different than just being able to physically counteract the animal world. And what they invented was genius, because it was the distribution of knowledge. That was a very important thing for a human being, a kind of a leap forward and the revolution among the animal world. How it worked? A human being got some kind of knowledge, and that knowledge was supposed to be shared with other members of the community they worked in, the society. And initially, the knowledge that human beings got about how the world exists, what are the dangers and the risks in this world, and they could actually share it using, at that time, a very primitive system of representation of knowledge. So this knowledge went to one human being, to another human being, to the third human being, to the fourth one. And so as a result, if, for example, there was some kind of a risky situation, and in that risky situation, a human being could actually oppose that risky situation with the help of other human beings. It was very important to give other human beings the idea why it is risky and what kind of risk it was. For example, a savage, an ancient man, was getting out of the cave, and it was very important for him to say that there is a kind of a danger in the ambush somewhere opposite the cave, like a lion or a tiger or any other animal. And the other man who was sitting, let's say, on the top of the mountain could cry or shout something to the man who was getting out of the cave that there is a danger, giving him some kind of an indication what sort of danger was waiting for him. And it was very important to say what was the size of the danger, what is the speed of the danger, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the quality of representation of that knowledge that was given by one man to another man at some distance was highly important. And when that signal that was passed from one person to another person reached him, and the reaction was immediate, the person understood that it was very dangerous to go in that direction, immediately at that very moment, the fact of the cognitive revolution actually happened. Because at a distance, human beings could exchange the information that was absolutely vital for their survival. That's important. Little by little, a human being realized that the quality of this representation signal was something could be considered some sort of a saving his life and saving the life of the whole community. So when we were developing as a society, we started working on the way this knowledge could be represented in a more and more advanced, in a more and more ideal way. Probably you would never find an animal in the animal world who would be teaching his cub or his child standing in front of the tree, like exercising in some kind of physical activity for hours. Like, for example, a human being would take a bow and an arrow, and they will be standing in front of the tree and shooting arrows again and again, hoping that the small of the family could learn the same skill very quickly. So that passing on of one bit of knowledge from one member of the society to another member of society was highly important, and people started improving that general scheme, the general system of knowledge that helped the whole society survive. As we developed, the languages developed, and we started developing our brain in a particular manner, and this development of the brain was the exercise that implied a lot of effort that was not necessarily reduced to logic or to analysis. The human brain began developing variously, and maybe quite inadvertently, without thinking hard about that, people thought it would be very good if a human brain developed broadly through non-logical exercises, non-analytical exercises, as it were. They started inventing fairy tales, folklore, all sorts of parables, and something that actually didn't exist. Why was that important? Because they realized that when there is a one-to-one correspondence between one bit of knowledge and another bit of knowledge, and that one-to-one correspondence developed only one area of the brain, and the search mechanism did not exist. Therefore, it was important to somehow start wiring your brain very broadly to such an extent that in different situations of life, your brain will work immensely, in an immensely capable way, covering a whole variety of circumstances and situations. How does it happen? In the Bible, there is an episode when the prophet Isaiah says to the people who were standing around him that he had a vision. He saw the king in his mind when he was sleeping. The vision meaning he was sleeping and he had a dream vision. And he saw the king, and he said in the Bible, "Woe upon me, because I am a man of unclean lips, living among unclean people, and I saw in my vision the king." And then the angel came up to him, touched his lips with a live coal and said, "Now you are cleansed." What happened next was very peculiar for understanding the subject that I'm developing at this very moment. God said, "Whom shall I send?" And Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." And God gave him the instruction how the prophet should speak to people. Isn't it wonderful? This is the only episode in the whole of the Bible when God gives a direct commandment to the prophet how to speak to people. And he says, "Go to these people and speak to them in such a manner that seeing they shall not see, and hearing they shall not hear, and shall not understand." Isn't it incredible? God commands the prophet to speak to people in an unclear manner, not directly explaining to them what should be done, but in an unclear manner. Why so? And what did the prophet do actually to fulfill the commandment of God? They started using parables. They started using all sorts of allegories, indirect statements, indirect descriptions. For what purpose? Because indirect descriptions of the world and what is happening sets your brain thinking widely. It sets your brain thinking in an extremely diverse and expandable manner. That was very important for the human being to understand something that did not exist in this world. I mean, the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven was described in the Bible, and the prophets were giving people the idea of what the kingdom of heaven is. And you could not describe it because it doesn't exist here. Therefore, what is the way to describe it? You could describe it only indirectly, only through allegories, metaphors, allusions of all kinds. And this could be done only if you fire your brain in a particular manner, in a different manner, in a manner where your brain works as a whole and not only one part, one analytical part of the brain works. The human being started developing this indirect kind of description, indirect kind of communication, as far back as about 35,000 years ago. About all sorts of fairy tales, myths and legends started to appear, and little by little human society developed it as a highly advanced manner of communication. What is happening with the invention of computers? With the invention of computers, we start looking for a very precise manner of representation of knowledge. We want to know exactly what kind of weather we're going to have tomorrow. What should we do if some sort of occasion happens? If there is a storm, if there is an avalanche, if there is an earthquake, we want to know exactly when, at what point it is happening, and what should we be doing to save our lives. That is the reality of the 20th century, the second part of the 20th century and of the 21st century. All right, and people started thinking how to make that knowledge more exact. Naturally, mathematics got in here, and people started thinking in terms of formula. But instead of actually delegating this kind of precise knowledge to the computers fully, people started thinking probably that it wouldn't be bad if the human mentality would also be digital. But it's impossible, because a human brain does not operate digitally. A human brain operates as a whole, as a big substance that is covering the whole of existence. We actually tend to live in the cognitively rich environment. That's important. We operate in the cognitively rich environment. While I'm talking to one person, at the same time I see somebody standing by my side and doing something, and I have some kind of a side vision of the person who is by my side and behave accordingly. But somehow, without explaining, people are trying to develop the so-called exact knowledge. When a small boy or a child or a schoolboy or a student, when he or she would know the exact answer to an exact question that was the indicator of a very high class of knowledge, that is actually not quite real, that is not quite objective what is happening in the human world. Let me explain how it means, and then I will return how it works, and then I will return to this scheme, because in this scheme knowledge was shared between people. And then in the 21st century, in this circle of people who were the receivers of the knowledge, we started to replace people occasionally with computers. And that's already an absolutely different algorithm of communication. Because if formerly there were people who were trying to store the information in their memory, to improve this information considerably, and to make this information useful to other members of the community, we actually kick out people from here and we replace these people with computers, hoping that computers will store the information better than human beings. But a computer is not thinking in an analog manner. A computer is thinking in the matrix manner, one-to-one correspondence of knowledge. Therefore, we don't know what will happen to this society when suddenly, at a certain point of human development, the whole of this circle will be replaced, or the greater part of this circle will be replaced with computers and not people. Because there is a definite rift between the way human beings think and computers operate. And yet we do it for the benefit of the society of people, not for the society of computers. Therefore, we don't know whether this kind of the knowledge circle is actually operatable, useful for us, or a different one. Let me explain how we human beings think and work and communicate generally, and what is happening in the digital world in a more detailed manner. What I'm going to draw is not a brain, but a functional vision of how we human beings operate our brain. There's a circle which is divided roughly into 4 areas. In the left area we may call it logical, and in the right area we shall call it imaginative or intuitive. The upper side of that will be called the generation of knowledge or the generation of speech, and the lower side will be called the perception. Imagine you want to write something very important, and when you want to write something important, you begin with language. But when you begin with language, you naturally need to use some kind of rules, and you begin naturally with grammar. What you write or what you speak should be grammatically correct. That's important. Because if it is not grammatically correct, people will not be listening to you. They will be thinking that you are producing some sort of nonsense, and therefore they wouldn't be able to understand it very well. Okay, once your writing is grammatically correct, the next step that you are making is logic. You are trying to make your writing logical. To make this writing logical, you need to start correlating different parts of your writing, trying to achieve the level of understandability that is generally acceptable, the way people understand it. After that, after your writing is grammatically correct, and logically intact, you start thinking about real facts, knowledge, dates, names, and all that scope of information that you are adding is would be called an epistemics. Epistemics means your intellectual experience. You need to mention names, create all sorts of references, allusions. You need to give your person an idea that you have a greater vision of what is happening in the area, in the knowledge area that you are describing to him at this very moment. And finally, when you are writing grammatically correctly, logically clearly, epistemically rich, finally you want to use occasional emotional expressive words to make your message more convincing. Therefore, the last part that you are using is the emotion. You are using all sorts of words that are expressing your attitude to what you are saying or writing. When you read it, so this is the creation, right? The way the language is created. When you read seemingly along the same line, along the same route. You begin with grammar, you'll see logic, you recognize names and facts, and you are emotionally reflecting on what is happening right now in this writing. What is happening in the oral language is absolutely different. It goes the other way around. When, let's say, a big politician starts speaking to the crowd, the first thing that he's doing, he's trying to cause an emotion. People start reacting to him in some way. People start shouting when his name is mentioned, and we definitely see that the perception actually goes the other way around, from emotion to grammar. The person may be even making grammatical mistakes. Nobody will notice that. The person may be making logical mistakes, and people will not notice that. What they will notice is how emotional he is at this very moment, and whether he's using right names and right historical facts. And as a result, the person who knows this scheme or has this scheme in his mind will be manipulating the audience in a more effective way. Actually, human beings, depending on their profession, operate this scheme differently, and we shall see that probably there will be people who belonging to different professions who almost extensively use one part of this functional diagram. I say actors in theaters and cinemas will be predominantly using the so-called emotional algorithm of thinking. Actors and producers would probably be using epistemic kind of knowledge and emotion, because they will need to know facts and names, quote from books, quote poems, and doing it very emotionally. Therefore, they will be thinking almost exclusively about how to combine these two parts of the diagram. If you think of politicians or the so-called political technologists are thinking about how to affect masses of people, or politicians, masses of people. Therefore, in the first place, they will be thinking about emotion, occasionally epistemics, mentioning the right names, the right facts, the right dates, which is important, and yet adding some kind of a logical paradigm to what they're saying to make their speech more convincing. So this scheme from here to here, I would call the area of political technology, this one. Let us think of those people whose manner of thinking is mostly logical and epistemic. Just these two sections of my diagram. These are mostly intellectuals, people who know a lot about history, about who write books, about who Shakespeare was, who Pushkin was, who Dostoevsky was, what Winston Churchill was doing, and they would be trying to build up a kind of a diagram of their own vision of the world based on their historical knowledge, on their real knowledge of artifacts of all kinds, and building it into a logical framework. So that's it. Well, when you're thinking of the executives, meaning people who are performing somebody's will, well, we're seeking the best executive who would be capable of actually understanding the whole scope of knowledge
And in that particular case, we expect that if we say, let's say, the writer or the editor or the copywriter, the people who create texts or who create the basis for communication, we expect that these people would be grammatically correct, logically intact, epistemically clever, emotionally charged, all these things taken together. So these people should have the whole span of knowledge. Although very often, when we say use just linguists, let's say, who would be dealing with your text, it's enough for us, let's say, for a proofreader, for the person to know only grammar and orthography, right? So this kind of knowledge would be most sufficient for a proofreader. And we do not expect that a proofreader would be sufficiently clever to cover the whole area of communication. That's practically impossible. Very often, I would notice that, for example, when I'm using the services of the designers, people who need to draw something, I realize that this part of my spectrum doesn't work in them at all. They make mistakes, huge mistakes, and they think only about beauty. They're not thinking about logic, they're not thinking about epistemic. Their vision is almost exclusively emotional. And therefore, when, for example, you write a text, and then you want a certain designer to bring this text to an acceptable form so that the public would perceive it very well, there is a great rift between you as the creator of the text and the designer, who is thinking in absolutely different terms. Where are you? You are here. That's you. So that's where you stand. This is where the linguist or a proofreader stands, and this is where a designer works. Therefore, you need to think how to improve communication in this particular case, where things are almost incompatible. And the only way to achieve perfection in this case is to organize a team of people with different modes of thinking, with different modes of perception. Then comes the lower section of my chart. And the lower section of my chart is almost exclusively perception. If this is speech generation, this is perception. You know, just off top, I would say that what I described to a certain extent can be related to the way many people think our brain works. Because we have the so-called left hemisphere, the so-called right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is dealing with the logical analysis, analytical kind, and the right is more intuitive. But this is only a very abstract relationship between the two. So I'm not drawing the scheme of the brain naturally. All right, the perception side. When I speak, I have a feeling that people who are sitting in front of me understand me. But the likelihood that people understand you is very small, because very often we belong to different cultures, we belong to different levels of education. We just don't know whether people who are sitting in front of us understand us at all. And if you check, let's say, after every 5 minutes, whether the person who is sitting in front of you understood you by asking questions, you will probably realize that the amount of understanding is very, very small, very often about 20%, sometimes 15%. And when a lecturer is performing a lecture, for example, even in Moscow State University, I'm not quite sure that the degree of perception by the students of the lecturer is 100%, very unlikely. And even it actually goes down and down and down, even less than 50%. Why so? I say attention of the audience dwindles naturally. Naturally, people may belong to different cultures, to different cultures of perception, not only cultures, meaning historical cultures. And very often in your audience there may be Chinese students, or there may be Vietnamese students, there may be students from Africa, and your hope that your logical presentation will affect them, I think, is futile, because they may have different logic, a different way of perceiving things. You know, very often when you change just one element in your message, and you put this element in a different emotional perspective, people will immediately start rebuilding their whole communication based on that single element that you made very important for them. Thus, for example, if I start occasionally using the words that are very marked in the Russian language by mistake, For example, you'll be telling me something and I will be saying in response to you in Russian, верую, 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 верую. What? Верую? That's impossible because we use this word only in special kinds of contexts, right? We can't say верую because in normal Russian we say yes, I believe, верю, 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 верю. But you can't say верую, верую, верую because that will be a slightly different, this will give you a slightly different framework of thinking immediately. Just one small change in the word creates that alteration. All right, therefore, when I'm generating something, I need to think clearly about how what I generated linguistically can be perceived. All right. This is a huge area of research and dealt mostly by phenomenology. But it's interesting that when I made a search in history about who was developing different schemes of language perception, I found out that there were two big schools, so to speak, the German school and the Arabic school. And I was very much pleased, and it surprised me a lot, that the Germans and the Arabs actually coincided a lot in many things. Okay, let me begin with the Germans. Edward Husserl, professor of Marburg University, who was the founder of the so-called phenomenology of speech. What is phenomenology? Phenomenology is the way you perceive something in communication. It's the analysis of what is happening in your brain in the course of perception. And it's interesting that perception, if it is perceived as something immediate, happening right now, is so different in many people, even sitting in the same room. I can give you just one simple word. I'll say apple. And the moment I pronounce the word apple, one person will have a green apple in his mind, another person will have a red apple in his mind, the third person will have a telephone in his mind, a smartphone, and the fourth person will have a drawing of the apple in his mind. And it's mostly unpredictable. And the worst thing of all is that it is uncontrollable. It's just uncontrollable. When I talk, you simply have no time to subject what I'm saying to the logical analysis. You are actually following the track of the phenomenology of your brain at that very moment. Your brain actually gives you all kinds of visions and sensations and emotions which create a particular vision that controls you almost entirely. I had an experiment one day. I was asking my student to give me the immediate vision after reading a sentence in an English book. The person was Russian, and she never went abroad. All her life she lived in Russia, in a small place. And we opened a book by Kate Fox, watching the English, and the first sentence ran as follows. She was sitting in a small pub off Paddington Station with a small brandy in her hand. I didn't wait a second, and I asked her, I said, Dasha, could you please tell me immediately what sort of picture your brain produced at that very moment? She was sitting in a small pub off Paddington Station with a small brandy in her hand. I say, she has never been abroad, she has never been in London, she has never been in Paddington Station, and she doesn't drink alcohol. Okay. And she said, honestly, I immediately imagined Kazansky railway station. I'm sitting in Shokoladnitsa, sipping my coffee. I say, yes, exactly. It's interesting. It's as different from what the person said in the beginning as possible. Isn't that incredible? I'm telling her of England, of Paddington Station, and of a small pub there, small English pub, and she's thinking of Shokoladnitsa near Kazansky railway station at that very moment. Her brain reacts in that particular manner. Does communication happen at this moment between me pronouncing this sentence and Dasha? Of course not. Communication is not happening. I'm thinking of one thing, she's thinking of another thing. Therefore, we need to think about the way it works with other people, and with the growth of human society, we become increasingly dependent on these different modes and levels of communication in order to reach stability and balance in the society. That's very important. Therefore, the study of the way, the analysis of the way the human language and speech is perceived by people, that's highly important. All right. What Edward Husserl said. Edward Husserl pronounced one simple word, statement. He said, back to things again. And his idea was the following. when we perceive the reality, we perceive the reality in the form of the so-called noimas. Noima. What is noima? Noima is a dynamic representation of the reality around you. It's, see, when I'm standing here in front of you, I can move my head to the left, or to the right, and the reality is moving actually in my brain in an intact and clear and smooth manner. In a smooth manner, right? I do not have cracks. I can't imagine that a dragon may suddenly appear from some crack and say, "Wah!" at this very moment. No. Likewise, when we read a book or when we say something, we want to create the same kind of reality in the minds of people who are sitting in front of me. That kind of intact, smooth reality in the brain of my audience is noima. Noima exists as a generally, at a basic level, as a combination of elements that form this reality who are some kind of correspondence with each other and interaction with something. So the combination of elements is called noesis. Noesis. So noesis is just the elements of the construction. You know, when you go, for example, to the fine art exhibition, you go to Tretyakov Gallery, and you stand in front of the set painting by a talented artist. You watch it, and you watch it as a whole, as a picture, and you may even approach it occasionally or stand back in order to see the change of some kind. The colors the painting is using is noesis. Your perception in different perspective is noima. But there is one more element. It's called intentionality. Intentionality. What is intentionality? Intentionality is your recognition of the whole in a preliminary manner. Intentionality is the way you start, when you start recognizing the whole in advance by certain small elements. It's like when I'm giving you, let's say, the vision of something that looks like a geometric figure. For example, I draw to you this, and then this, and then this. And I ask you a question, what is that? You say, it's a triangle. I say, no, there is no triangle here. But your brain suggests that there is a triangle there, right? You start building it up in some kind of manner. You are in the habit of filling up gestalts, filling up the images that are given to you in the form of small elements, and you start reconstructing the whole on the basis of small elements. Intentionality is largely this: your premature understanding of what you expect to happen in a second with you. And Martin Heidegger said that the main element that is actually helping intentionality work is what he called care. Care is when you try to think how actually to put it all together in this particular manner, or in that manner, or in that manner. Care is your effort at completing the unfinished gestalt. These three things are in charge of your perception. And the Arabs, interestingly, within the framework of their esoteric studies, they have added up 4 elements of perception. It was very important for them. The first element they call tafakkur. Tafakkur is the word that is used for the reading of the Quran. Tafakkur is your analysis, is your capacity to analyze things. And they say that it's impossible to perceive knowledge without analysis. Analysis is a very important thing, therefore they call it tafakkur. Tafakkur is based on the analysis of the elements of something. The second element of perception in their vision is the necessity to concentrate on something almost entirely. They call it huzur. Huzur is a way of concentrating on things almost entirely. Every schoolboy remembers that from school. When you open a book of fiction and you start reading it, after probably 20 minutes or 30 minutes, you forget the entire reality and you become completely involved in that reality. You start living in the book that you are reading. And when people try to prevent you from that context, you become angry and irritated. So this full concentration on what is happening is called huzur with Arabs. But Edward Husserl introduced in the German philosophy, introduced a notion that is very, very close to huzur. He was using the Greek word epoche. Epoche. What is epoche? Epoche means brackets. Brackets. Brackets means that you need to put the reality in some sort of frames in order to understand it very clearly. It's not by chance that we have the Russian word epocha. What is epocha and epoche is the same word. Epocha means some sort of reality that exists within certain brackets, within certain framework, and we try to actually establish a balance between elements within epoche. Likewise, when you read a book, and in that book you are focused almost exclusively on those people, on those actions, on those activities that are described right now, at that very moment in the book. And that is also epoche, and for the Arabs it is called huzur. Then, as you read on and on and on, you want to associate your own experience and your own knowledge with the experience of those actors that were presented in the book. For the Arabs it's called muraqaba. Muraqaba means your capacity to establish the relationship between your experience and the experience that is presented to you. At that moment you start crying, you start being angry as if it is happening to you really. And there is a great parable that was, or legend maybe, or story told to me by one person in the Caucasus. He was describing to me a very interesting situation. There was a very old man sitting in a village, and one day, and he was reading a book, and one day a roaming poet entered the village, and they greeted each other, and the old man was asking the young man, "Who are you, and what are you, and what are you doing?" And this man said, "I'm a poet." He said, "Could you recite to me something?" He said, "Yes," and he recited to him just 2 lines. And when he finished reciting the 2 lines, the old man started crying. And he was crying so severely and for such a long time that the whole of his clothes became wet with tears. When he actually calmed down a little bit, the poet asked him, "What happened? Why were you crying so severely?" And he said in response, "For months I'm reading the Quran here, and not a single tear appeared in my eye. And now came you, and you recited your bait 2 lines, and the whole Quran blossomed in my mind as a garden of paradise." It appeared that just the logical reading of that book that was sacred to him didn't touch his heart to the extent when a new element suddenly appeared and triggered the appearance of the whole picture. That's muraqabah. When you actually allow one element to unite your world and the world of someone who is presenting it to you. And finally, when you are completely dissolved in this new world, the Arabs call it fana. Fana means complete dissolvement in that new reality that is not yours. What is happening is here is the general scheme of how we people think, is the general scheme how we perceive the linguistic reality that is presented to us. And for our professional purposes, for our everyday purposes, we need to think a little bit about how to adapt it to our modern needs, and whether we should develop more actively the so-called analog kind of thinking or the so-called digital kind of thinking. Let me show you a diagram. Imagine you are a company that is tailoring clothes for women, and you are thinking of colors. In that particular case, you may think either in terms of spectrum, now we can show it on the screen, either in terms of spectrum, and when we look at the spectrum of red colors, the variety of red is so huge that you can never decide what kind of color you are going to use for the current seasons for women. Whether it would be the red that is at the right top corner of the spectrum, or slightly to the left, or closer to the bottom, you don't know it. And you don't know what the reaction would be, because different variations of red may cause different emotions in people. Therefore, you actually cast away the spectrum representation of the red color and you start thinking about matrix. You start thinking about matrix. Why matrix would be more important and more interesting than spectrum? Because in matrix, you choose a particular kind and variation of the red color that you know for sure people will perceive generally. For example, in that matrix that you see now on your screen, we may have the so-called wine red color, or Chinese red color, or tulip red color, or blood red color. Every one of them will have its own label of understanding. And therefore, when you, for example, would enter a shop, would enter a tailor's shop, and some kind of a dress would be presented to you, the person who is selling this dress to you, he would say, now we have an absolutely new collection with Chinese red. And you would immediately have this kind of associations with China, shades of meaning that are associated to the red color. Matrix, in terms of marketing, in terms of perception, seems to be a more readily solution for direct sales. It seems that when you present the whole variety of the red color to people, the likelihood that they will understand the whole of it is very, very small. Therefore, you need to reduce it. You need to reduce it considerably in order to be able to, for them to understand it very, very clearly. So the same is happening with language. The same is happening with language. When we write, formerly we were thinking that the more complex your writing is, the higher is the intellect that you are having. Therefore, we like to read Tolstoy, we like to read Dostoevsky, and we spend hours and hours actually going into the details of the text. And we were not against analyzing very complex syntactical structure that exists in the text. And through that exercise, we were developing our brain. What is happening today, right now, is an active stream of simplifications of all kinds. We have adaptations, we have rewritings of all kinds, and many people think that by adapting a certain knowledge that was previously complex to the modern world, they are doing good to this world. In fact, they are not doing good, but they're impoverishing the intellectual world of the people who are standing in front of them, who are perceiving it. Therefore, if I had a child, for example, who would be telling me that he wants to be a philologist or a linguist or a philosopher, instead of giving him the adaptation of the great works by great Russian writers or English writers, instead of giving him adaptations, I will send him exploring the most complicated linguistic structures that are presented in the books by this or that writer. I want him to be able to see the spectrum rather than matrix, because matrix is simplification of perception, while spectrum is the wiring of the brain through firing. You need to fire the brain, the whole of it. You need to have the picture where you create not a one-to-one correspondence, but one-to-many correspondence. Normally, we think like that. This is a bit of knowledge, and then there is some kind of a reality, right? And the task is, as in many modern exercises for multiple choice, they say, what is the right relationship? They say this, they say wrong. They say that, wrong. This, very good, a good solution. But human brain doesn't think like that. Human brain thinks differently. Human brain says, well, this is also possible, and that is possible. And therefore, each next particular element may be related to 5 or 6 other elements, which will also be right. And this particular element may be related to 5 or 6 other elements. And this one will have some kind of an associative relation with that previous element. Therefore, the human brain is thinking almost exclusively in this analog kind of way or method. Imagine Shakespeare and Hamlet. In Hamlet, when Hamlet sees the ghost of his father, and the ghost of his father tells him that his uncle poisoned him, Hamlet pronounces a phrase, "While memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, remember thee." What is globe? What is seat? What is seat and where seat? You say, well, this is probably a metaphor. So while memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, remember thee. What is globe? Is globe my head? Or is globe the world? Or is it globe theater? We don't know. And therefore the interpretation of the actor who's actually pronouncing this phrase in the theater, the interpretation will be in the gesture. He can say, while memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, meaning head, or in this distracted globe, meaning the theater, he will be showing, pointing at different people sitting there in the theater or in the world. But Shakespeare was using the word globe to mean three things simultaneously. Three things simultaneously. Distracted globe could mean distracted world. Distracted globe could mean simultaneously distracted mind. And distracted globe could mean simultaneously people sitting right now in the globe theater. So, what should machine be doing with this particular writing that is presented to you in this matrix kind of, unmatrix, in this non-digital form? It will not be coping with this polyphony of meanings and shades of meanings. Therefore, I'm saying for the machine, it's important to receive the product that is more or less possible for this bit of information to be transformed into recognizable algorithm where the one-to-one correspondence exists, while human brains do not exist in that manner. But in the modern world, we're increasingly subordinated to the necessity to computerize everything. Therefore, we're simplifying everything in order to bring it to the level that will be easily transformed into recognizable algorithms by computers to make it transformable into applications, computer applications, something that can be used on our everyday basis. And unfortunately, this relates also to something that is very, very human, like literature and intellect and art. All of these things tend to be computerized. Imagine a picture that you see on a television screen, where there is a film, where it is digital. In that picture you see the colors are fantastic, a beautiful colors, right? And in that particular case, when you imagine for a second whether these colors actually exist in the world, you say no. The real colors are not so bright. The real colors are not so contrastive. The real colors are more shady. And yet you like this very bright picture on the screen. What is happening is the digitalization of color. So that a greater variety of people will be perceiving the same picture in a more or less in a more or less similar way. Therefore, let's say the green color or the red color or the yellow color exists only in the reduced number of forms that is perceivable by the increasingly large number of people. Therefore, in order to cover the expanding, the scalable size of the market, you need to transform the very complex analog reality into the digital reality. But this does not transform your thinking from analog kind of thinking to the digital kind of thinking. So all these things are impossible. Therefore, my conclusion is the following. In the modern world, for human development, I would probably invite human beings to think in a human manner, in the sense that you would allow yourselves to create variations and shades of meanings, accepting and perceiving the complexity of the world in its real form of representation, without simplifying it. And you can only simplify it or bring down to the form of matrix only in those areas where it is necessary for you, like let's say in such areas as law or exact science or digital science, where you'd think about high technologies, these things that are very risky for human society when you are building or when you are developing or manufacturing some sort of a device or airplanes, machines of high complexity. In that particular case, you need to bring down the human perception information to this one-to-one correspondence kind of form, where the matrix form representation becomes the only solution, because there is only one kind of mechanism that is acceptable in that particular case, that looks, if there is presented in a simplified manner, in the form of if-then. If this condition happens, then the reaction would be like that. While the human world is broader than that. And you say, in those areas where digital thinking is important, I'll be creating the digital communicative products. But in all other areas, the areas that are absolutely human, that are important for the survival of the human beings, as people who have culture, who have education, who have intellect, I will probably stay away from digitalization. And I would rather think of increasing complexity of communication rather than decreasing it. Because we think mistakenly that by decreasing complexity of communication, you improve communication. Not at all. You are bringing it to the level of those people who are incapable of thinking in a complex manner. But these are already not people, right? But people of lower intellect are not the best representatives of the society. We need people who are capable of dealing with complex notions, with complex realities, and dealing with complex realities, and thinking about them in various terms. Therefore, my message is very clear, it's very simple. Don't try to use the word combination digital thinking broadly. Do not apply it to everything. Digital thinking is good only for digital purposes, while analog thinking is the human kind of thinking, and we need to develop this in order to stay on this planet, because if we don't, then little by little this circle of knowledge will be replaced little by little by computers only. And in that case, we shall have no place in this world, because the representation duty will be fulfilled almost exclusively by machines, and in that particular case, where we, human beings, be. Thank you.